Throughout this week, attention has turned to the battlefield in the skies over Ukraine. And here's why. Mykolaiv in the south. Russian missiles struck this Black Sea port city overnight, part of what the Kremlin's calling targeted attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. Tell that to this couple, surveying the remains of their home. Or this 11-year-old pulled from the rubble of this apartment block after 6 hours trapped inside.
I was asleep, and then I was thrown to the ground. I don't even remember how I ended up here. I guess the explosion threw me. Now I don't have a flat anymore.
To the west outside Kyiv, another bombing. Ukrainian officials say critical infrastructure was hit by so-called kamikaze drones, although they deny it. These drones most likely supplied to Russia by Iran. This week's strikes, the most widespread in months, have resulted in a laser-guided coordinated response from the West. NATO defense ministers gathered in Brussels today. The question, how to help the Ukrainians defend their skies. The answer, missiles and the systems to operate them, billions of pounds worth. This is what the UK has pledged. Medium-range rockets capable of shooting down Russian cruise missiles. Other countries, including the US, France and Germany, are also sending advanced air defense weaponry. Promises described by Kyiv as historic. NATO is seeking to better protect its own skies too. Plans now for more than a dozen allies to cooperate around the procurement of high-tech missile defense systems from the US or Israel.
This is a common approach to our joint responsibility for the security of our continent, and we do this by pooling our resources.
3,000 miles away in Kazakhstan at a summit of Asian countries, continent-sized furniture as the distance between Putin and his erstwhile allies on the international stage grows larger. The UN General Assembly last night voted overwhelmingly to condemn Russia's illegal annexation. Tellingly, China and India abstained. Turkey voted along with 142 other countries condemning the annexation. But these two men have a complicated relationship. President Erdogan of Turkey and Putin today. In July, Turkey helped broker a deal to restart grain shipments out of Ukraine. Now, according to Putin, it could provide an alternative route for Russian gas to enter the market, bypassing the Baltic pipelines.
We could consider the possibility of building another gas pipeline system and creating a gas hub in Turkey for sales to third countries, primarily, of course, to European ones, if they're interested in this.
Abandoned Russian kit in the southern Kherson region, proof of the success of Ukraine's recent counterattack here. The Russian-installed governor has told people to evacuate ahead of what could be fierce fighting. The latest front line in a war that's heading into winter.
Well, joining me now, Dr. Richard Haas, who's president of the Council on Foreign Relations and former advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell in the George W. Bush administration. Dr. Haas, we have the NATO allies pledging more military aid, but given that Ukraine says they've only got 10% of what they need to defend themselves from Russian missile attacks, is it anywhere near enough?
Well, obviously, they've got to provide significant assistance against both cruise missiles and drones. The threat is not from Russian aircraft, so they don't really have to focus on that. They also continue to need the rest of the military help in order to press the campaign against Russia in the south and the east. And obviously, most of all, they may need economic help from the Europeans. There's an enormous gap between what's been promised to Ukraine and what's actually been dispersed from European governments. So they need help across the board. It's critical now in the run-up to winter. Once winter begins, things may to some extent calm, though there's nothing about winter that would probably make it more difficult for Russia to continue to shoot off cruise missiles from a distance.
We've seen an intensification of the Russian attacks this week. How crucial, is there a sort of an inflection point, as Porrick put it just earlier, this week, or not, in your view?
No, it's not. I think what we're seeing from Mr. Putin from Russia is what I would describe as an indirect strategy. They're losing on the battlefield. So what they've done is essentially chosen 3 other domains in which to pursue their goals. One is to attack civilian areas, energy important locations within Ukraine. Secondly, they are threatening the use of nuclear weapons in order to get the United States to back off. Thirdly, they're looking for ways to cut energy supplies even further to Europe. What they want to do is essentially weaken the will of the parties supporting Ukraine. They want to weaken Ukraine's support as a way of almost compensating for their failures on the battlefield.
I mean, there's this idea that Putin may run out of missiles quite soon, and yet you see him with his allies at this meeting of Asian countries, including Turkey, today. Is he less isolated than the West thinks, do you think?
It's a good question. He was pretty isolated in the vote in the General Assembly the other day, but that was a vote without teeth. He's still able to sell discounted oil to China and India in enormous quantities. So the price of oil has gone up in the last few days thanks to the OPEC Plus decision. So this says to me the Russian economy is going to do just fine for this foreseeable future. What Mr. Putin's most concerned about is not so much his allies as he is his domestic opposition. And what he wants to do more than anything else is placate those on the right. That explains these missile attacks on Ukraine. And it's his effort to show the people at home that he can still take the war to others. But I think at the moment he's in a position where he can continue to do the sort of thing he's doing. The one thing beyond his control is his ability. What he can't do is change the dynamic of the conventional military battle. He is not winning. He is losing that. And I don't see where he has any tools in his kit bag to change that dynamic.
And we've seen this Ukraine success in Kherson, and there's fighting talk about taking back Crimea. Do you think the West, Europe really, as they're in the grip of this cost of living crisis, they'll increasingly urge Ukraine to compromise, and Russia too will try and look for a diplomatic off-ramp, or is that increasingly unlikely?
No, I think you're right. I think that will happen. It could happen out of a fear of an escalation to nuclear. It could happen if it's a long, cold, difficult winter because of energy shortages. Obviously, Ukraine, though, will resist those kind of constraints. It will continue to ask for military help for both offensive and defensive operations. And so I think for the time being, at least, this war is going to play out. Indeed, I think the most likely scenarios through the winter and beyond that the war continues. People keep looking for a diplomatic breakthrough. Unlikely. And I would think for the foreseeable future, we'd all better get accustomed to the possibility or even likelihood that this is something of a long war. Look, after all, this has been going on since 2014. So the idea that it would go on for another year or two or three, perhaps not at the same level of intensity that we've recently seen, but the idea that it would continue ought not to shock anybody.
Dr. Richard Haas, thank you very much for joining us.